I stood in the grand dining room, surrounded by family, yet feeling utterly alone. The chandelier cast shadows across their faces as my daughter Clara's words hung in the air. "You're becoming such a burden, Mom. We're all just tired of making accommodations for you." The room fell silent, forks suspended midair, eyes darting between us. I simply smiled, placed my napkin beside my barely touched salmon, and walked away with the knowledge that tomorrow I would be changing my will. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Retirement wasn't supposed to feel this way. After 45 years of teaching elementary school children, I had imagined peaceful days in my garden, weekend visits from my daughter and her husband, and eventually grandchildren running through my modest but comfortable home. What I hadn't anticipated was the gradual shift in Clara's attitude once her career in corporate law took off and she married James, a real estate developer with family money and connections that opened doors I never could. The dinner that evening had been Clara's idea. Family time, she called it, though these gatherings had grown increasingly tense over the past year. At 68, I wasn't elderly by any means, but a recent fall had left me with a slight limp and occasional need for assistance. Nothing major, certainly nothing that justified Clara's mounting impatience or the way she rolled her eyes when I asked her to repeat something said too quietly. That night, the breaking point came during dessert. Clara and James had been discussing their upcoming vacation to the Maldives, voices animated as they described private bungalows and underwater restaurants. When I mentioned I'd been feeling a bit isolated lately and asked if perhaps they might consider visiting me for a weekend before their trip, the conversation screeched to a halt. "Mom," Clara sighed, setting down her spoon with deliberate slowness. "We have careers, responsibilities. We can't just drop everything because you're feeling lonely." "I understand that, dear," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I wasn't suggesting you cancel anything, just thought maybe a Sunday brunch sometime might be nice." That's when James exchanged a look with Clara, that conspiratorial glance that married couples develop, a silent communication that excludes everyone else. Clara cleared her throat and straightened her designer blouse, a gift from her mother-in-law that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Look, we need to have an honest conversation," she began, her tone shifting to what I recognized as her courtroom voice. "James and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for you to consider assisted living." The suggestion landed like a physical blow. My house, the same one where I'd raised Clara as a single mother after her father abandoned us when she was just 4 years old, was my sanctuary. The garden where I'd taught her to plant sunflower seeds. The kitchen where I'd stayed up countless nights helping her prepare for tests while working 2 jobs to make ends meet. "But I'm perfectly capable of living independently," I protested, feeling a flush creep up my neck. "The doctor said my mobility's already improving and—" "It's not just about your physical health, Mom," Clara interrupted. "It's about facing reality. This house is too big for you to maintain. You're isolated here. And frankly, we're concerned about your cognitive state." "My cognitive state?" I echoed, genuinely confused. James leaned forward, adopting what I assumed was his best sympathetic expression. "You've been repeating yourself more lately, Elizabeth, forgetting small details. We've all noticed it." I sat back, genuinely shocked. Yes, occasionally I misplaced my reading glasses or forgot the name of an actor in a film, but who didn't? At their ages, Clara and James certainly did the same thing. The difference was no one was pathologizing their normal memory lapses or using them as justification to uproot their lives. "And then there's the financial aspect," Clara continued, now on a roll. "The property taxes on this place keep increasing, and your pension only stretches so far. Selling now would give you a comfortable cushion for quality care." What Clara didn't know, what I had never told her, was about the inheritance from my own mother. My practical, frugal mother, who had lived simply but invested wisely, leaving me a sum that would have astonished my daughter. Money I'd kept separate, allowing Clara to believe I lived solely on my teacher's pension, while I quietly grew that inheritance through careful management and a financial advisor who saw value in my caution. I'd been saving it all for Clara and her future children. Nearly $2 million that could have paid for college educations, down payments on homes, security in uncertain times. Money I'd planned to surprise her with when the time was right. "We've actually looked into several facilities," James added, pulling out his phone and sliding it toward me with images of what looked like an upscale hotel lobby. "River Pines has an excellent reputation. They have activities, on-site medical care, and you wouldn't have to worry about home maintenance anymore." I looked up the photos of smiling seniors, playing cards and doing gentle yoga, all within the confines of an institutional setting, no matter how luxuriously disguised. This was what my daughter wanted for me, to be neatly tucked away where my occasional needs wouldn't disrupt her carefully curated life. "And the best part," Clara said with false brightness, "is that it's only 30 minutes from our house, so we could visit much more often than we do now." The irony wasn't lost on me. They rarely made the 20-minute drive to my home now. How would adding another 10 minutes magically create time in their busy schedules? I pushed my dessert away, appetite gone. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready for that step. This is my home, Clara. It's where I belong." Clara exchanged another look with James before setting down her napkin with finality. "This isn't really a suggestion, Mom. We've discussed it, and we think it's necessary." "We've discussed it," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "You and James have decided what's to become of me and my home?" "Don't be dramatic," Clara said, her tone sharpening. "We're thinking of what's best for you." "What's best for you, or what's most convenient for you?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Clara's face hardened. "And there it is, the guilt trip. You know, this is exactly why we've been avoiding these conversations. You always make everything so emotional instead of practical." "Forgive me for being emotional about being forced from my home," I replied, feeling tears threatening. That's when Clara said it, the words that would change everything between us. "You're becoming such a burden, Mom. We're all just tired of making accommodations for you." The dining room fell silent. Even James looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat and studying his wine glass with sudden interest. Clara's words hung in the air, impossible to take back. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. When had she become this person? This stranger who saw her mother as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I searched her face for any trace of the little girl who once crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, who made me handmade Mother's Day cards with too much glitter, who cried on my shoulder after her first heartbreak. Instead, I saw a woman in an expensive outfit, with a carefully maintained appearance and a coldness in her eyes that broke my heart more thoroughly than her words ever could. In that moment, I made my decision. I carefully folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. "I think I should go," I said quietly, rising from the table. "Mom, don't be ridiculous. You're being overly sensitive," Clara protested, but I noticed she made no move to stop me. "I'll call you tomorrow," though I already knew I wouldn't. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt the same way. James awkwardly offered to drive me home, but I declined. The evening air was crisp as I waited for my rideshare, giving me time to collect my thoughts and formulate a plan. By the time I arrived home, a strange calm had settled over me. I made myself a cup of tea, sat in my favorite armchair by the window that overlooked my carefully tended garden, and began making mental notes. The next morning, I called my attorney, Frederick Winters. He'd been handling my affairs since Clara was born and had helped me manage my mother's inheritance all these years. I made an appointment for that afternoon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Frederick's office hadn't changed much over the decades, The same leather chairs, the same mahogany desk, even the same collection of sailing ship models displayed on the bookshelf behind him. The familiarity was comforting as I settled into the chair across from him. "This is quite a sudden change, Elizabeth," he remarked, after I explained my intentions. "Are you certain you want to make such a dramatic change to your will?" "I've never been more certain of anything," I replied straight enough. "Clara has made it abundantly clear where I stand in her life. I won't reward that behavior with financial security she hasn't earned." Frederick removed his glasses and polished them thoughtfully. "You know, in my 40 years of practice, I've seen family dynamics shift in all sorts of ways. Sometimes these rifts heal with time. And sometimes they don't," I countered. "I've spent my entire life putting Clara first. I worked extra jobs to pay for dance lessons and SAT prep courses. I went without so she could have opportunities I never did. And now that I'm aging, now that I occasionally need support rather than always providing it, I've become, in her words, a burden." Frederick nodded slowly. "I understand. But removing her entirely from your will is a significant step. Have you considered a smaller inheritance? Something symbolic, perhaps?" I shook my head firmly. No half measures. Clara needs to understand that relationships are reciprocal. That family means being there for each other through all stages of life, not just when it's convenient. "And you're certain about the new beneficiaries?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. "The West Side Community Center changed my life when I was a struggling single mother. Their after-school program gave Clara a safe place to stay when I had to work late. Their emergency fund helped me keep the lights on one winter when I got pneumonia and couldn't substitute teach for a month. They support families who are where I once was, determined but struggling." Frederick made notes as I continued outlining my wishes. Half of my estate would go to the community center, with specific allocations for their education programs and emergency assistance fund. The other half would be divided between a scholarship for single parents returning to college and a trust for my dear friend Margot's grandchildren, who had shown me more genuine care and concern in recent years than my own daughter had. "And the house?" Frederick asked. "I want it sold, with the proceeds added to the estate," I replied. "Clara made it clear she sees it only as a financial asset, not as a home filled with memories. So be it." As Frederick drafted the new will, I felt no vindictiveness, no petty satisfaction, only a profound sadness mixed with the certainty that I was doing the right thing. This wasn't about punishing Clara. It was about honoring my own worth and dignity in my final years. "There's one more thing," I added as Frederick prepared the documents for my signature. "I don't want Clara to know about these changes until after I'm gone. Let her continue believing I have nothing but my pension and this house." Frederick frowned slightly. "You don't think that giving her a heads up might prompt some reflection on her part, perhaps even a reconciliation?" I considered his question carefully. If Clara changes her behavior and shows genuine remorse, I can always revise the will again. But I don't want her suddenly becoming attentive because she's worried about losing her inheritance. That wouldn't be authentic change. It would be performance for profit. After signing the new documents, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For decades, I'd carried the responsibility of providing for Clara's future. Now, I was free to focus on my own present, on my own needs and happiness in whatever time I had left. Over the next few weeks, Clara called several times, each message more impatient than the last. I listened to her voicemails but didn't return them. Instead, I began making other changes in my life. I joined a watercolor class at the local senior center. I volunteered at the library's literacy program 3 mornings a week. I started having regular Sunday brunches with Margot and her family, who never made me feel like I was imposing by simply existing. A month after that fateful dinner, Clara showed up unannounced on my doorstep, her expression a mixture of annoyance and concern. "Mom, what's going on?" she demanded as soon as I opened the door. "I've been calling for weeks. I thought something might have happened to you." "I'm perfectly fine," I replied calmly, stepping back to allow her entry but not offering a hug or any particular welcome. "As you can see, I'm managing quite well in my own home." Clara followed me into the kitchen, where I had been preparing lunch, a simple quiche and salad. Nothing fancy, but the normalcy of the scene clearly took her aback. Perhaps she'd expected to find me surrounded by unwashed dishes and unpaid bills, further evidence of my supposed decline. "You look good," she said, sounding almost disappointed. "Thank you," I replied, continuing to chop vegetables for my salad without missing a beat. "Would you like some tea?" Clara declined the offer and sat at the kitchen island, watching me work. "So you've just been ignoring my calls because—" "I needed some time to think after our last conversation," I said evenly.
Being called a burden tends to require some processing. Clara at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I didn't mean it like that, Mom. I was just frustrated. You know how stressful work has been lately, and James and I have been talking about starting a family, which adds another layer of pressure." "I understand stress, Clara," I said, setting down my knife and meeting her gaze directly. "I raised you alone while working full-time and taking night classes to finish my degree. I know all about pressure and difficult choices." "That's different," she protested. "Yes, it is," I agreed, "because I never once considered you a burden during any of it. Not when you had colic and I hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch for weeks. Not when you needed braces I could barely afford. Not when you decided to change majors junior year and needed an extra semester of tuition. You were never a burden, Clara. You were my child, and I loved you unconditionally." Clara's eyes darted away from mine. "I didn't come here to argue about semantics." "No?" I raised an eyebrow. "Why did you come then?" "To check on you, obviously," she said with a hint of defensiveness, "and to continue our discussion about River Pines. They have an opening coming up next month, and we need to make a decision." I smiled sadly. "We don't need to make any decision, Clara. I've already made mine. I'm staying in my home." "Mom, be reasonable." "I am being entirely reasonable," I interrupted, my voice firm but not unkind. "This is my home, my life, my decision." Clara's frustration was palpable. "So you're just going to stubbornly stay here until what? Until you fall again and no one's around to help? Until you can't manage the stairs or the garden work?" "If and when those days come," I replied calmly, "I'll adapt. I've already looked into home modification grants through the county aging services. I've interviewed several home health agencies for when I might need part-time help. I've even joined a senior ride-share program for when driving becomes too difficult." Clara blinked, clearly surprised by my thoroughness. "You see," I continued, "I don't object to planning for my future needs. I object to being treated like an inconvenient problem rather than a person with agency and dignity." "That's not fair," Clara protested. "We were trying to help." "Were you?" I asked softly. "Or were you trying to solve what you see as the problem of Mom in the most convenient way for yourselves?" Clara stood abruptly. "I can see this conversation isn't going anywhere productive. You're determined to see us as the villains." "No, Clara. I just want to be seen, really seen, as the woman who has loved you fiercely every day of your life. As someone deserving of the same care and consideration I've always shown you." For a moment, something flickered in Clara's eyes. Perhaps recognition, perhaps remorse. But it was quickly replaced by the practical, efficient lawyer's expression I'd grown accustomed to. "We'll talk about this again when you're being more rational," she said dismissively, gathering her purse. "In the meantime, I've left some brochures on the hall table. At least look at them." After she left, I collected the glossy River Pines materials and placed them directly in the recycling bin. Then I returned to preparing my lunch, a strange sense of peace settling over me. Clara would eventually discover the changes I'd made to my will, but by then it would be too late. Not too late for her to reflect on her choices, perhaps, but too late to fake affection in hopes of financial gain. Over the next year, our relationship settled into a pattern of occasional strained phone calls and even more infrequent visits. Clara had indeed become pregnant, and while I was genuinely happy for her, the news also highlighted the growing distance between us. She didn't ask my advice about childbirth or motherhood. She didn't invite me to her baby shower, though I later saw photos on social media. I sent a lovely gift, a hand-knitted blanket and a collection of the books I used to read to her as a child, but received only a brief text message in acknowledgement. When my grandson Henry was born, I wasn't called until the next day. I visited the hospital with flowers and another small gift, cooing appropriately over the perfect little boy with Clara's chin and James's eyes. I offered to help during those difficult early weeks, perhaps prepare some meals or simply hold the baby while Clara napped, but I was politely informed that James's mother would be staying with them for the first month. I accepted this with grace, though the sting was sharp. I had been a good mother.
I would have been a wonderful grandmother, given the chance. As Henry grew, I sent gifts for holidays and his birthday. I made occasional attempts to be part of his life, suggesting park outings or offering to babysit. Most would decline with various excuses about busy schedules or Henry's separation anxiety. On the rare occasions when I did see him, I treasured every moment, storing up memories like precious gems. 3 years passed this way, with me building a fulfilling life that didn't center around waiting for Clara's approval or inclusion. I traveled, modest trips, but adventures nonetheless. I made new friends. I took classes in subjects that had always interested me, but that I'd never had time for during my working years. I volunteered extensively, finding purpose and helping others who appreciated my contributions. Through it all, I maintained my health as best I could. Regular checkups, careful attention to my diet and exercise, managing my arthritis with both medical care and gentle yoga. I was determined not to become the burden Clara had accused me of being. Then came the diagnosis. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer, already spread to nearby tissues. The oncologist was gentle but honest about my prognosis. 6 months, perhaps a year, with aggressive treatment. The cancer had likely been growing silently for some time, explaining the vague discomfort and fatigue I'd attributed to aging. I sat in the doctor's office, absorbing this information with surprising calm. Not acceptance, exactly. I wasn't ready to leave this world I'd grown to appreciate even more in my later years. But I felt a certain clarity about how I wanted to spend whatever time remained. When I called Clara with the news, her reaction was everything I'd hoped for as a mother, but had learned not to expect. Shock, distress, immediate offers to help with appointments and treatment options. For the first time in years, she didn't mention assisted living or my cognitive state. Instead, she listened as I outlined the treatment path I'd chosen after careful consultation with my medical team. "I'll come with you to the first chemo session," she insisted. "James can watch Henry or bring him along if needed." I agreed, touched by her sudden attentiveness, even as a small, wounded part of me wondered where this concern had been before my diagnosis. Was it genuine remorse or merely the socially acceptable response to a parent's terminal illness? I wanted to believe the best of my daughter, but our history made that difficult. The day before my first chemotherapy appointment, Clara arrived with an overnight bag. "I thought I'd stay with you," she explained, "just for a few days until we see how the treatment affects you." I welcomed her into my home,
the home she'd been so eager for me to sell, and showed her to the guest room that was rarely used these days. That evening, as we sat in my living room with cups of herbal tea, Clara seemed uncharacteristically nervous, fidgeting with her wedding ring and avoiding my gaze. I've been thinking a lot since your diagnosis, about our relationship, about how things have been between us these past few years. Oh, I kept my tone neutral, waiting. I've been unfair to you, Mom, she admitted, her voice catching slightly. More than unfair. I've been cruel in ways I didn't fully recognize until I was forced to face the possibility of losing you. I remained silent, allowing her the space to continue. When Henry was born, I found myself remembering all the things you did for me as a child, the sacrifices you made, the endless patience you showed. And instead of that making me more appreciative, it somehow made me resentful. She looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time. I think I was angry that I'd never properly acknowledged how much you gave up for me. So instead of facing that guilt, I pushed you away, made you the problem. Her honesty was unexpected and touched something deep within me. But years of emotional distance had taught me caution. Thank you for saying that, Clara. It means a lot to hear. I'm not just saying it because you're sick, she insisted, reaching from my hand. I've been doing a lot of work in therapy this past year, trying to understand why I've been so resistant to having you involved in Henry's life when you were such a wonderful mother to me. It's not you, Mom. It never was. It was my own issues that I projected onto you. I squeezed her hand, feeling the first tendrils of hope that perhaps something genuine could be salvaged between us. We all make mistakes, Clara. What matters is recognizing them and trying to do better. I want to do better, she said firmly. I want Henry to know his grandmother. I want us to rebuild what we had before I let my insecurities ruin it. That night, as I lay awake considering Clara's words, I thought about the will sitting in Frederick's office, about the decisions I'd made in a moment of profound hurt and disappointment. I wondered if I should call him, make yet another change to reflect this apparent reconciliation. But something held me back, caution born from experience, perhaps. I decided to wait, to see if Clara's remorse and renewed attention lasted beyond the initial shock of my diagnosis, to determine whether this was a genuine change of heart or simply the appropriate performance of a dutiful daughter during her mother's illness. The coming months would reveal the truth, one way or another, and I had time yet, perhaps not as much as I'd once assumed, but enough to make a final decision about my daughter's inheritance, enough to observe whether the burden she'd once accused me of being had truly become the mother she now claimed to cherish. The days following my first chemotherapy session were more difficult than I'd anticipated. The nausea came in waves, leaving me weak and disoriented between bouts of being violently ill. Clara stayed true to her word, remaining by my side through that first terrible week. She brought cool washcloths for my forehead, made bland foods that I might be able to keep down, and handled phone calls from concerned friends when I couldn't summon the energy to speak. In those quiet moments between treatments, when the medication allowed me brief periods of clarity, I observed my daughter with new eyes. Gone was the impatient, dismissive woman who had called me a burden. In her place was someone attentive and gentle, someone who seemed genuinely concerned about my comfort and well-being. She spoke to me with respect, listened when I shared memories from her childhood, and didn't rush away at the first opportunity. "Do you remember the summer we went camping at Lake Windermere?" I asked one afternoon as we sat in the sunroom, me wrapped in a blanket, despite the warmth of the day, a persistent chill being one of the many unwelcome side effects of the chemotherapy. Clara smiled, setting aside the novel she'd been reading. How could I forget? It rained for 3 days straight and our tent leaked like a sieve. We ended up sleeping in the car, I recalled, chuckling at the memory. You were so small then, maybe 9 or 10. You thought it was a great adventure. Because you made it feel that way, Clara replied, her expression softening. You never let on how miserable you must have been, cramped in that tiny Honda with a squirmy kid and all our soaked camping gear steaming up the windows. I reached for her hand, surprised by the emotion welling up. That's what mothers do. We turn disasters into adventures, find joy in the midst of disappointment. It's the greatest skill I ever learned. Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I haven't been very good at that with Henry, I think. I get so stressed when things don't go according to plan, so focused on what's going wrong instead of finding the opportunity in the chaos. You'll learn, I assured her. It took me years to master that particular magic. Will you teach me? She asked softly, and the vulnerability in her voice made my heart ache with a mixture of hope and caution. While there's still time? I squeezed her hand. I'd like that very much. As the weeks passed and I endured the brutal cycle of chemotherapy treatments, Clara's presence remained constant. She arranged her work schedule to accommodate my appointments, often bringing her laptop to the treatment center so she could stay with me through the long hours of infusion. James brought Henry for brief visits, carefully timed for days when I was feeling stronger, when I could sit up and interact with my grandson without frightening him with my increasing frailty. Henry was shy at first, hiding behind his father's legs and peering at me with uncertain eyes. But children adapt quickly, and soon he was climbing onto the sofa beside me, showing me his favorite toy dinosaurs or asking me to read from the picture books Clara brought along. During such a visit, as Henry napped in Clara's arms, James sat across from me with an uncharacteristically serious expression. "I owe you an apology, Elizabeth," he said, his usual confident demeanor replaced by genuine contrition. "I was wrong about you, and wrong to support Clara's push for assisted living. I hope you can forgive me."
I studied his face, searching for signs of insincerity but finding none. "What changed your mind?" "Seeing you these past months," he replied without hesitation. "Your strength, your dignity in the face of this illness, and honestly, seeing how much Henry adores you, how much he benefits from having you in his life." He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that reminded me he was still young himself, still finding his way as a husband and father. "My own grandparents died when I was very small. I never had what you're giving Henry. That intergenerational connection, that sense of family history. I was wrong to try to deprive him of that." His words touched me deeply, not least because they acknowledged what I'd been silently giving to my grandson all along. Stories, traditions, a living link to his family's past. Things that couldn't be measured in financial terms or practical considerations. "Thank you, James. That means a great deal to me." As my condition worsened despite the treatments, Clara suggested moving me to their home, where they had converted the downstairs study into a bedroom so I wouldn't have to navigate stairs. "We can arrange for a home health nurse during the day when we're at work," she explained, showing me photos of the room on her phone. "And in the evenings and on weekends, we'll be right there. Henry is so excited about having his grandma come stay." The offer was tempting. The chemotherapy had left me weaker than I cared to admit, and managing alone was becoming increasingly difficult. Still, I hesitated. "I don't want to impose," I said carefully. "Your lives are busy enough without adding a sick woman to the mix." Clara knelt beside my chair, taking both my hands in hers. "Mom, listen to me. You are not an imposition. You're family. My family. Henry's family. We want you with us for whatever time we have left together." I searched her face for any sign of reluctance or duty-bound resignation, but found only sincere concern and love. "You're sure?" "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied, and I recognized my own words from that day in Frederick's office echoed back to me. "Please come home with us, Mom. Let us take care of you the way you've always taken care of everyone else." 2 days later, I moved into Clara and James's spacious colonial in the suburbs. The room they'd prepared for me was lovely, painted in soft blues and greens, with a hospital bed positioned near large windows that overlooked their backyard garden. They'd hung some of my favorite artwork from my house and arranged family photos on the dresser, creating a space that felt both familiar and new. Henry was delighted to have me there, bouncing into my room each morning before school to show me his outfit or tell me about his dreams from the night before. Even on my worst days, when the pain and nausea were nearly unbearable, his innocent enthusiasm brought moments of joy that made the suffering more bearable. Clara proved herself a devoted caregiver, managing my medications, coordinating with the home health nurse, and spending her evenings sitting beside my bed, sometimes talking, sometimes simply providing quiet companionship as I drifted in and out of sleep. She rarely showed frustration or impatience, even when my care required middle-of-the-night attention or disrupted their family plans. One evening, about 2 months after I'd moved in, I woke from a light doze to find Clara sitting beside my bed, watching me with an expression of such profound sadness that it caught my breath. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked, my voice raspy from the dry mouth that plagued me constantly now. She started, not realizing I'd awakened. "Nothing, just thinking." "About?" She hesitated, then admitted, "About all the time I wasted. All the years I kept you at arm's length because of my own stupid pride and insecurity. Years we could have been close, when Henry could have known you better, when we could have made memories together instead of—" Her voice broke and she looked away, blinking rapidly. "We're making memories now," I reminded her gently. "Good ones." "But there's so little time," she whispered, the words catching on a sob she tried to suppress. "There was always going to be too little time, Clara," I said, reaching for her hand. "That's the nature of life. What matters is that we found our way back to each other." She wiped her eyes with her free hand. "I just keep thinking about that awful dinner. The things I said to you. Calling you a burden when you've never been anything but a gift in my life."
We all say things we regret, I soothed. You've more than made up for it since. Clara shook her head fiercely. No, I don't think I can ever make up for it. But I want you to know that I understand now. I see you, Mom. Really see you. Just like you asked me to that day in your kitchen. And I'm so sorry it took something this terrible to open my eyes. I tugged her hand until she moved from the chair to sit on the edge of the bed. Then I pulled her down to rest against my shoulder as I had when she was a child frightened by a storm or a bad dream. She came willingly, curling against me carefully to avoid disturbing the IV port or pressing against the areas where pain was most acute. "I forgive you," I murmured against her hair, "completely and without reservation." She cried then, quiet tears that dampened my nightgown and released years of tension between us. I held her as best I could with my weakened arms, offering the unconditional love I had always felt for her, even during our most estranged moments. When her tears subsided, she sat up and met my gaze directly. "There's something else I need to say, something James and I have been discussing." "Oh?" I prompted when she fell silent. "We want you to know that we've decided to remain in this house after you're gone. We were planning to move to a larger place next year, but now we've decided to stay here instead, so that Henry will always have this connection to you, the room where his grandmother stayed, the garden you helped us plant. We don't want to lose that tangible link to you." The sincerity in her voice moved me deeply. This wasn't about property values or investment potential, the cold calculations that had dominated our previous discussions about my house. This was about preserving memories, about honoring the significance of my place in their family history. "That means more to me than you can know," I told her truthfully. As we sat together in the gentle evening light, I thought again about my will, about the decisions I'd made in anger and hurt. Clara had changed, profoundly and genuinely. She demonstrated not just remorse for her past treatment of me, but a fundamental shift in her priorities and values. She'd become the daughter I'd always hoped she would be. Not perfect, certainly, but thoughtful, caring, and deeply connected to family in a way that transcended material considerations. The next morning, when Clara left for work and Henry for preschool, I asked James to help me make a phone call.
With his assistance, I arranged for Frederick to visit me at the house the following day. Though clearly curious, James respected my privacy and didn't ask questions about the purpose of the appointment. Frederick arrived promptly at 10, his familiar face lined with sadness as he took in my diminished state. He sat beside the bed, placing his briefcase on the floor and taking my frail hand in his warm grasp. "It's good to see you, Elizabeth," he said sincerely, though circumstances were different. "As do I replied with a wry smile. "But we play the hand we're dealt, don't we?" He nodded, squeezing my hand gently before releasing it. "Your call suggested some urgency. How can I help you today?" I took a shallow breath, the simple act of filling my lungs more difficult than it had been even a week ago. "I need to make changes to my will." Frederick's expression remained neutral, professional. "I see. What sort of changes did you have in mind?" "I want to restore Clara as my primary beneficiary, with provisions for Henry's education, of course. And I still want to leave something substantial to the community center. They do important work, and that hasn't changed. But the bulk of the estate should go to Clara and her family now." "May I ask what prompted this decision?" Frederick inquired, not judgmentally, but with genuine interest. I smiled, thinking of the past few months, of Clara's unwavering care, of James's sincere apology, and of Henry's joyful presence in my final days. "Reconciliation," I said simply, "the kind that comes from genuine change, not the performance for profit I was worried about before." Frederick nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad to hear it. Family estrangements are among the saddest situations I encounter in my practice. It's rare and wonderful when healing occurs." "It is," I agreed, "and in this case, the healing is real."
Clara has changed, or perhaps more accurately, she's found her way back to the person she always had the potential to be. She deserves to know that I recognize and honor that change. As Frederick took out the necessary paperwork and began explaining the modifications we would make, a profound peace settled over me. The inheritance that had once been a weapon in my arsenal of hurt had transformed into a final gift of love and acknowledgement. Not a reward for Clara's care during my illness, but recognition of the genuine reconciliation we had achieved. The restoration of a mother-daughter bond that had bent under pressure, but ultimately proved unbreakable. The changes to my will completed, I asked Frederick for one additional favor. "There's a letter in my desk at home, the small roll top in the study. Would you retrieve it for me? I'd like Clara to have it, but not until after I'm gone." Frederick promised to fulfill this request, his eyes suspiciously bright as he packed away his papers and prepared to leave. At the door, he turned back for a final word. "You've always been one of my favorite clients, Elizabeth. Your integrity, your compassion, your clear-sightedness, even in difficult circumstances, they've been an inspiration to me professionally and personally." "Thank you, old friend," I replied, touched by his words, "for everything." After he left, I dozed, awakening later to find Clara sitting beside me, having returned early from work. She held a book in her lap, one of the novels I'd loved and recommended to her many times over the years, but that she'd never made time to read. Now she was halfway through it, a small sticky note marking her place. "How is it?" I asked, my voice a whisper now, energy for normal speech increasingly hard to summon. She looked up, smiling when she saw I was awake. "Beautiful. You were right. I should have read it years ago." "Better late than never," I murmured. a phrase that seemed to encapsulate so much of our journey together. Yes, she agreed, setting the book aside and leaning forward to adjust my pillows with gentle hands. Better late than never. In the weeks that followed, my condition deteriorated rapidly. The oncologist confirmed what I already knew. The cancer was winning this battle, and the time had come to transition from treatment to palliative care. Clara arranged for hospice services, transforming my room into a peaceful sanctuary where pain management and comfort took precedence over the harsh fight against an implacable enemy. Through it all, Clara remained steadfast. She took family leave from her job, spending her days by my side, reading to me when I was too weak to hold a book, helping me sip water or broth when I could manage it, simply holding my hand when nothing else was possible. James brought Henry for short visits, carefully explaining to the child in age-appropriate terms that Grandma was very sick but still loved seeing him. One evening, as twilight painted the sky outside my window in shades of lavender and gold, Clara sat beside me, gently applying lotion to my painfully dry hands. The hospice nurse had just left after administering my evening medications, and a rare moment of clarity had emerged from the increasingly frequent fog of my consciousness. "Clara," I said softly, "I want you to know something important." She paused in her ministrations, giving me her full attention. "What is it, Mom?" "I'm proud of you," I told her, each word deliberate and weighted with significance. "Not just for how you've cared for me these past months, though that has been extraordinary. I'm proud of the woman you've become, the mother you are to Henry, the way you've grown into your best self, even when it meant facing difficult truths about yourself." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, maintaining her composure because she knew emotional scenes exhausted what little energy I had left. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means everything to me." "There's more," I continued, needing her to understand this final message while I still had the clarity to convey it properly. "After I'm gone, you'll learn some things that might surprise you, things I kept from you. I want you to know that every decision I made, even the ones you might not initially understand, was made with love." Confusion flickered across her face. "What do you mean?" "You'll understand soon enough," I assured her. "Just remember that I love you unconditionally, that I always have, even during our most difficult times, and that I'm leaving this world with my heart full because we found our way back to each other."
Clara leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently against mine in an intimate gesture of connection. "I love you too, Mom, more than I can ever express." 2 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning with Clara holding one hand and James the other, I slipped away from this world and whatever comes next. My last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude, not for the material possessions I'd accumulated or the inheritance I was leaving behind, but for the priceless gift of reconciliation that had allowed me to depart in peace, surrounded by genuine love rather than duty or obligation. Frederick delivered my letter to Clara a few days after the funeral, along with the revelation of my financial circumstances that I had kept hidden for so many years. In that letter, I explained my initial decision to disinherit her after the dinner where she'd called me a burden, and my subsequent choice to restore her as my primary beneficiary after our reconciliation. I shared my hopes for how she might use the unexpected inheritance, not just for her own family's comfort, but to continue the tradition of helping others that had been so important to me throughout my life. Clara would tell me later, much later, when we met again in whatever realm awaits souls who have completed their earthly journeys, that the letter and the knowledge of my earlier will had indeed shocked her deeply, not because of the money itself, but because it forced her to confront how close she had come to destroying our relationship beyond repair through her carelessness and self-absorption. "It was the greatest lesson of my life," she would say. "Learning that true wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts or property values. That the real inheritance you left me was the example of your forgiveness, your resilience, and your capacity for unconditional love even in the face of rejection." And she would tell me how that realization shaped the rest of her life, how she used a portion of the inheritance to establish a foundation supporting single parents and their children, how she instilled in Henry and his younger siblings the values of compassion and family loyalty that I had tried to teach her, how she became known in her community for her generosity rather than her legal prowess or material success. But all of that lay in a future I would not witness from my earthly vantage point. What I carried with me into eternity was the peace of knowing that the burden I had briefly been called had transformed in those final precious months into a blessing for us both, a catalyst for the healing that allowed me to depart this world surrounded by genuine love, leaving behind not just financial security, but a legacy of reconciliation that would shape generations to come. Clara stood before the gathered mourners, her black dress a stark contrast to the vibrant fall colors surrounding the cemetery. The autumn breeze gently rustled the leaves above, creating a natural symphony that seemed fitting for the occasion. She gripped the podium, steadying herself as she looked out at the faces, friends, colleagues, former students, and neighbors who had come to pay their respects to Elizabeth Morgan, beloved teacher and community member. My mother once told me that the true measure of a life well lived isn't found in bank accounts or achievements. It's found in the lives you touch, the love you share, and your capacity for forgiveness when others fall short. Her gaze fell on Henry, her 4-year-old son, sitting solemnly on James's lap in the front row. The boy clutched the small teddy bear his grandmother had given him during their last visit together, his eyes wide with a child's confusion about the permanence of death. Many of you knew my mother as Ms. Morgan, the third-grade teacher who stayed after school to help struggling students, who organized book drives for the library, who baked cookies for every school event even when she was working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Clara paused, her throat tightening with emotion. But I knew her as Mom, the woman who sacrificed everything to give me opportunities she never had, the woman who never missed a dance recital or school play, even when it meant taking extra shifts to pay for those activities, the woman who taught me through her example that resilience isn't just about surviving hardship, it's about doing so with grace and without becoming bitter.
As Clara continued her eulogy, memories cascaded through her mind like autumn leaves caught in a gust of wind. Childhood bedtime stories read in different voices for each character. Science fair projects sprawled across the kitchen table, college application essays edited late into the night. 1,000 small moments of care and devotion that she had taken for granted until they were nearly lost. "What many of you don't know," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, compelling the mourners to lean forward, "is that my mother and I went through a difficult period in our relationship a few years ago. I became caught up in my own life, my own ambitions, and I failed to recognize the incredible gift I had in a mother who loved me unconditionally." Clara's eyes met James's across the space between them, drawing strength from his encouraging nod.
I made the terrible mistake that many of us make with the people closest to us. I assumed she would always be there, that there would always be time to repair what I had damaged through my neglect and self-absorption. I treated her as an afterthought in my busy life, something to be managed rather than someone to be cherished. A murmur rippled through the gathering, discomfort mingling with recognition. How many of them had made similar mistakes with their own loved ones? "But here's the extraordinary thing about my mother," Clara continued, her voice strengthening. "When I finally recognized my error and sought to make amends, she welcomed me back with open arms. No grudges, no recriminations, no keeping score of past hurts. Just pure, unconditional love and forgiveness." Clara reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, her mother's letter delivered by Frederick after the funeral, along with the shocking news of the inheritance. She wouldn't read it aloud. Those words were too private, too precious to share. But touching it gave her courage to continue. In her final months, as cancer ravaged her body, but never her spirit, my mother taught me the most important lesson of my life, that it's never too late to rebuild what has been broken, to heal old wounds, to find your way back to love. That even in our darkest moments, we have the capacity to choose compassion over resentment, connection over isolation, forgiveness over bitterness. Clara looked directly at Henry again, his small face solemn yet attentive. My son only had the privilege of knowing his grandmother for a short time, but her influence on his life and on the person I am becoming will ripple outward for generations. Because the greatest inheritance she left wasn't material at all. It was the example of how to live with dignity, how to love without conditions, and how to forgive without hesitation. As Clara stepped away from the podium, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the simple casket draped with her mother's favorite garden flowers. It felt, in that moment, like a benediction, a final motherly approval of words spoken from the heart. The weeks following the funeral passed in a blur of practical matters. There were thank you notes to write for flowers and condolences, her mother's modest house to clear out and prepare for sale, and most surprisingly, the complex financial arrangements to unravel with Frederick's patient guidance. "I still can't believe she had all this money," Clara said one evening as she and James sat at their dining room table, surrounded by financial statements and legal documents. "All those years living so frugally, working extra jobs, making do with less, and she had nearly $2 million just sitting there, growing." James studied the investment portfolio statements with admiration. "Your mother was incredibly savvy about money. These are conservative but consistently performing investments, regularly rebalanced, tax-optimized. She knew exactly what she was doing." "But why keep it secret? Why let me believe she was struggling financially?" Clara's voice held more wonder than accusation. "I think," James said carefully, "she wanted you to value things beyond money, to learn the importance of hard work and self-sufficiency. If you'd known about this inheritance waiting for you, would you have pushed yourself as hard through law school? Would you have developed the same work ethic?" Clara considered this, turning her mother's wedding ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had been Elizabeth's only piece of fine jewelry. "Maybe not," she admitted. "But still, all those hours she worked as a substitute teacher after retiring from her full-time position, all those budget-conscious meals and second-hand clothes, she didn't have to live that way." "I think she chose to," James suggested.
The letter said the money came from your grandmother, right? Maybe living simply was a value she inherited along with the money. Maybe for her, Wealth wasn't about what you could buy, but about the security it provided and what you could do for others with it. Clara nodded slowly, remembering her mother's constant small generosities despite her seemingly limited means. The anonymous donation to a former student's college fund, the grocery gift card slipped to a struggling new teacher, the holiday presents delivered to families experiencing hardship. Elizabeth had lived modestly not because she had to, but because it allowed her to give generously in ways that mattered most to her. The community center, Clara murmured, picking up another document from the stack, the partial bequest her mother had maintained even after restoring Clara as her primary beneficiary. She never forgot how they helped us when I was young. And now they'll be able to help many more families, James said, squeezing her hand. As Clara continued sorting through her mother's affairs, she discovered countless other examples of Elizabeth's quiet philanthropy. There were thank you letters from scholarship recipients who never knew their benefactor's name, records of regular donations to the food pantry, the literacy program, the women's shelter. Small but consistent support for causes that reflected her values, education, community support, creating opportunities for those who needed a helping hand. One rainy Saturday, while clearing out her mother's desk, Clara found a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of greeting cards. Opening it, she recognized her mother's neat teacher's handwriting filling the pages. It wasn't a traditional diary with daily entries, but rather a collection of reflections, quotes that had resonated with Elizabeth, and occasional accounts of moments that had touched her deeply. Clara settled into her mother's reading chair by the window and began turning the pages, feeling as though she'd been granted one final conversation with the woman she'd so recently lost. She read through stories of former students who had returned to thank Elizabeth years later, thoughtful musings on books that had moved her, and reflections on aging with grace despite society's tendency to render older women invisible. Halfway through the journal, an entry from 3 years ago caught Clara's eye, dated just a week after that fateful dinner when Clara had called her mother a burden. "Today I changed my will," Elizabeth had written. "Frederick was concerned, but I feel a strange clarity in this decision. The money that Mother left me, money I've safeguarded all these years for Clara's future, will now go elsewhere. Not out of spite, though the hurt is still raw, but because I've realized that leaving Clara a substantial inheritance without her understanding its true value would be my final failure as her mother." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she continued reading. "Perhaps I've failed her already by not teaching her that worth isn't measured in productivity or convenience, that human dignity doesn't diminish with age or physical limitation, that family means supporting each other through all of life's seasons, not just when it's easy or convenient." Tears blurred Clara's vision as she read the next lines. "I still love her with every fiber of my being. That hasn't changed, and never will. But love sometimes requires difficult choices. The money will do good in the world through the community center and the scholarship fund, and Clara will have the opportunity to find her way back to the compassionate, empathetic person I know she can be, not motivated by financial gain, but by genuine recognition of what truly matters." Clara closed her eyes, remembering how close she had come to losing not just the material inheritance, but something far more valuable, the chance to reconnect with her mother, to make amends, to be present during Elizabeth's final months. If the cancer had been discovered later, if their estrangement had continued even a few months longer, the thought was too painful to complete. Instead, she returned to the journal, flipping forward several months until she found an entry dated shortly after her first visit to her mother following their period of estrangement.
"Clara came today," Elizabeth had written. "The first time in nearly 7 weeks since that terrible dinner. She seemed uncomfortable, defensive at first, but there was something else beneath the surface. Concern, perhaps, or the first stirrings of regret. Too soon to tell if this represents a genuine change of heart or merely obligation. I find myself hoping desperately for the former while preparing myself for the latter."
Clara turned more pages, following her mother's chronicle of their gradually healing relationship, first through awkward visits and strained phone calls, then through more natural interactions as they both made efforts to rebuild what had been damaged. The entries became less frequent during the progression of Elizabeth's illness, but one final entry, dated just days before her mother became too weak to write, brought fresh tears to Clara's eyes. Frederick came today. I've restored Clara as my primary beneficiary, though I've maintained provisions for the community center. Some might see this as rewarding her for caring for me during my illness, but that's not it at all. The change in Clara is genuine and profound. I see it in how she interacts not just with me, but with everyone, the hospice nurses, her son, even strangers. There's a new patience in her, a deeper empathy, an awareness of what truly matters. She's becoming the woman I always knew she could be, not because of my illness, but perhaps partly because of our estrangement and reconciliation. Some lessons can only be learned through loss or the threat of it. I leave this world at peace, knowing not just that my daughter will be financially secure, but that she understands the true wealth lies in how we treat each other, in the connections we nurture, in the love we give without expectation of return. Clara closed the journal, holding it against her heart as rain pattered against the window. Her mother had seen her so clearly, had witnessed her failures and her growth with equal clarity, and had loved her through all of it. The inheritance felt different now, transformed from a windfall into a sacred trust. Not just money to be spent or saved, but a responsibility to carry forward the values her mother had lived by. That evening, after tucking Henry into bed with one of the storybooks from his grandmother's collection, Clara joined James in their home office. She'd been formulating an idea ever since reading her mother's journal, and it was time to share it. "I want to start a foundation," she announced, settling into the chair across from his desk. James looked up from his laptop with interest. "What kind of foundation?" "The Elizabeth Morgan Foundation for Family Reconciliation, using part of Mom's inheritance to help estranged families find their way back to each other through counseling services, mediation, support groups, educational resources, maybe even retreat weekends where family members can come together in a neutral, supportive environment to begin healing broken relationships." James's expression softened as he listened to Clara outline her vision. A foundation that would honor her mother's legacy by helping other families avoid the pain of estrangement or find their way back from it before it was too late. "I think that's a beautiful idea," he said when she finished. "Your mother would be proud." "There's more," Clara continued, her excitement building as the concept took shape. "I want to scale back at the firm, maybe go part-time or a shift to consulting, use my legal background to help with the foundation, but also have more time with Henry and any future children we might have." She met his gaze directly. "I don't want to make the same mistakes again. I don't want to be so consumed by career ambition that I miss what's most important." James reached across the desk to take her hand. "I support whatever changes you want to make. You know that." Clara nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately, what Mom left behind, what I want to leave behind someday. And I keep coming back to her example, not the money she accumulated, but the lives she touched, the students she inspired, the community she strengthened through her quiet, consistent support." As spring arrived, bringing new life to the garden her mother had helped plant, Clara took the first steps toward establishing the foundation. She consulted with nonprofit experts, researched similar organizations, and began assembling a board of directors that included therapists specializing in family dynamics, clergy members experienced in counseling, and others committed to supporting healthy family relationships.
The process of selling her mother's house proved more emotional than anticipated. Each room held memories. The kitchen where Elizabeth had taught Clara to make her grandmother's recipes. The living room where they'd watched old movies together on rainy afternoons. The backyard where Clara had practiced dance routines while her mother called encouragement from the porch. But as Clara had learned through painful experience, the essence of her relationship with her mother wasn't contained in physical spaces or possessions, but in the values, memories, and love they had shared. The new owners, a young couple expecting their first child, fell in love with the house immediately, charmed by its character and the mature garden that Elizabeth had tended so lovingly. Clara found herself telling them stories as she showed them around, about the apple tree her mother had planted when Clara started kindergarten, about the window seat where Elizabeth had read aloud from chapter books on winter evenings, about the kitchen table where generations of family recipes had been prepared and shared. "Your mother sounds like an amazing woman," the young woman said, resting a hand on her pregnant belly. "I hope we can create the same kind of loving home here that she did." "I think she would like that very much," Clara replied, surprised to find that sharing these memories brought more comfort than pain. The foundation launched officially on what would have been Elizabeth's 70th birthday, with a small ceremony attended by family, friends, and community partners. Clara stood before the gathering, a portrait of her mother displayed prominently beside a simple plaque outlining the foundation's mission. "My mother believed that it's never too late to heal what's broken between people who love each other," Clara told the assembled guests. "She lived that belief by welcoming me back with open arms after I had pushed her away during a difficult period in our relationship. In doing so, she gave me the most precious gift possible, the chance to be present during her final months, to rebuild our bond, and to learn from her example of grace, forgiveness, and unconditional love." Clara gestured to Henry, now 5 years old, who stood proudly beside the portrait of the grandmother he still spoke of frequently. "Because of my mother's capacity for forgiveness, my son had the chance to know his grandmother, however briefly. He heard her stories, experienced her love, and will carry those memories throughout his life." Looking out at the faces before her, some familiar, some new allies in this mission, Clara felt a sense of purpose that transcended her previous ambitions. Too many families miss this opportunity for reconciliation. They remain estranged until it's too late, carrying regrets that can never be resolved. The Elizabeth Morgan Foundation aims to change that, to provide resources, support, and guidance for families seeking to rebuild relationships damaged by misunderstanding, hurt, or neglect. As Clara outlined the Foundation's initial programs, including counseling scholarships, mediation services, and educational workshops, she noticed Frederick sitting in the back row, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Her mother's attorney and friend had agreed to serve on the Foundation's board, bringing decades of experience witnessing both the damage family estrangements could cause and the healing that reconciliation could bring. "My mother once told me that the true wealth in life isn't measured in bank accounts or material possessions. It's measured in our capacity to love, to forgive, and to nurture the connections that sustain us through life's challenges." The Elizabeth Morgan Foundation is dedicated to helping families rediscover that wealth before it's too late. Because as my mother showed me through her own example, it's never too late to choose love over resentment, connection over isolation, forgiveness over bitterness. Later, as guests mingled during the reception, James approached Clara with a small gift box. "I was saving this for tonight," he said, placing it in her hands. "Open it." Inside, Clara found a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a small heart-shaped locket. When she opened the locket, she found a tiny photograph of her mother holding Henry as an infant on one side, and a miniature image of Elizabeth's handwriting on the other, the word forgiveness carefully preserved from one of her journal entries. "To remind you every day of the legacy you're carrying forward," James said softly. Clara fastened the bracelet around her wrist, the weight of it both tangible and symbolic.
As she moved through the reception, greeting supporters and explaining the Foundation's mission, she occasionally touched the locket, drawing strength from the connection it represented. That night, after the guests had departed and Henry was asleep, Clara stood in the garden her mother had helped plant, looking up at the stars scattered across the night sky. The foundation was just beginning its work, but already she had received dozens of messages from families seeking help, from individuals yearning to repair damaged relationships before it was too late. "I hope you can see this, Mom," she whispered to the night air. "I hope you know that your forgiveness didn't just heal our relationship. It's going to help heal many others too. Your legacy lives on, not just in me and Henry, but in every family that finds its way back to love because of what you taught me." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the apple tree, and Clara smiled, touching the locket at her wrist. The true inheritance her mother had left wasn't the money that had funded the foundation, but the profound understanding that wealth is measured not in dollars, but in relationships, not in possessions, but in the capacity to love without condition and forgive without reservation. Elizabeth Morgan had lived that truth quietly, consistently, throughout her life. Now, through the foundation that bore her name and the daughter who had learned her most important lesson just in time, that legacy would continue to grow and flourish, touching lives far beyond the modest home where she had raised her daughter with such devotion and love. 5 years passed, seasons turning like pages in a book, each one bringing new growth and transformation to Clara's life and to the foundation that had become her passion. The Elizabeth Morgan Foundation had expanded beyond her initial vision, now operating in 3 states with a growing staff of dedicated counselors, mediators, and support personnel. What had begun as a deeply personal tribute to her mother had blossomed into an organization that had helped hundreds of estranged families find paths toward healing and reconciliation. On this particular autumn morning, Clara sat in her office reviewing applications for the Foundation's newest initiative, retreat weekends where estranged family members could come together in a supportive, neutral environment with trained facilitators to begin the delicate work of rebuilding broken relationships. The demand had far exceeded their current capacity, a bittersweet affirmation of both the need for such services and the Foundation's growing reputation for effectiveness. A knock at her door drew her attention from the paperwork. James stood in the doorway, dressed in the casual business attire he favored for his real estate development firm, which had increasingly focused on affordable housing projects since their lives had been transformed by Elizabeth's inheritance and example. "Ready for lunch?" he asked. "Henry's class presentation is at 1:30, so we should probably head out soon if we want to eat first." Clara glanced at her watch, surprised by how quickly the morning had passed. "Absolutely. Just let me finish this note." As she jotted down her thoughts on the final application, Clara caught sight of the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one James had given her at the Foundation's launch, the locket with her mother's handwriting still intact after 5 years of daily wear. She touched it briefly, a habit that had become almost unconscious, drawing strength and perspective from the tangible reminder of her mother's legacy. "Done," she announced, gathering her purse and light jacket. October in their corner of the world brought crisp temperatures and spectacular foliage, the trees around their home ablaze with the same colors that had surrounded her mother's funeral 7 years earlier. What had once been a painful association had softened into a poignant reminder of life's cyclical nature: growth, harvest, release, renewal. As they drove to meet Henry at his school, Clara found herself reflecting on how much had changed since those dark days when her relationship with her mother had fractured. The young, ambitious attorney who had callously dismissed her aging mother as a burden seemed like a stranger now, someone Clara barely recognized when she looked back on that version of herself. "Penny for your thoughts?" James asked, noticing her contemplative silence. Clara smiled, reaching across to squeeze his hand where it rested on the gear shift. "Just thinking about Mom, about how proud she would be of Henry, of the Foundation, of us." "She would be," James agreed.
I still catch myself sometimes, wishing she could see how Henry's grown, how much Sophie reminds me of her. Their daughter, Sophie, now 2.5, had been born 3 years after Elizabeth's passing, a joyful addition to their family who displayed the same quiet determination and observant nature that had characterized her grandmother. Though Sophie had never met Elizabeth in life, Clara made certain her daughter knew her grandmother through stories, photographs, and the values that guided their family. They arrived at the elementary school 20 minutes before Henry's presentation was scheduled to begin. At 9, Henry Morgan Davidson was a thoughtful, articulate child with his father's analytical mind and his grandmother's compassionate heart, a combination that made his teachers predict great things for his future. Today's presentation was part of a third-grade project called Community Heroes, where each student researched and presented on someone who had made a positive impact in their community. Clara and James found seats in the back of the classroom, which had been arranged with chairs for visiting parents. Henry caught sight of them and waved excitedly before returning to a whispered conversation with his teacher, Mrs. Abernathy, a woman who reminded Clara strongly of her mother in her patient attentiveness to each child's needs. When Henry's turn came, he stepped confidently to the front of the room, holding a large poster board decorated with photographs and carefully written text. Clara felt her breath catch as she realized the subject of her son's presentation. "My community hero is my grandmother, Elizabeth Morgan," Henry began, his voice clear and steady. "Even though she died when I was only 4 years old, her work continues to help families in our community and beyond." As Henry proceeded to explain the Foundation's mission and programs in terms his classmates could understand, Clara felt tears gathering. James reached for her hand, squeezing it gently in silent support. "My grandmother believed that it's never too late to fix broken relationships," Henry continued, pointing to a photograph of Elizabeth on his poster, one taken during those precious final months when she had lived with them, her body frail but her smile radiating love. "She taught my mom that lesson, and now my mom teaches it to other families through the Elizabeth Morgan Foundation." Clara watched with a full heart as her son described the Foundation's work with the simple clarity of a child who had absorbed its mission through years of dinner-table conversations and occasional visits to the office. He spoke of weekend retreats where families learned to listen to each other again, of counseling programs that helped people say sorry and really mean it, and of educational workshops that taught communication skills to prevent estrangements before they began. "But the most important thing my grandmother taught us," Henry concluded, looking directly at his parents with a smile that echoed Elizabeth's, "is that true wealth isn't measured by money or stuff. It's measured by how we treat each other, especially when it's hard to be kind or patient. That's why she's my hero, because her lessons keep helping people long after she's gone." The applause from classmates and parents alike was enthusiastic, but Clara barely registered it through the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Her 9-year-old son had distilled the essence of his grandmother's legacy more perfectly than any professional writer crafting Foundation materials ever had. After the presentations concluded and the students were dismissed for lunch, Henry bounded over to his parents, poster in hand. "Did you like it?" he asked eagerly. "Mrs. Abernathy said I explained everything really well." "You were absolutely amazing," Clara assured him, pulling him into a hug that he accepted without the embarrassment that would likely come in another year or two. "Grandma Elizabeth would have been so proud of you." "Really?" Henry's face lit up at the praise. "Really," James confirmed, ruffling their son's hair affectionately. "In fact, I think this poster deserves a special place at the Foundation office, don't you, Clara?" "Absolutely," she agreed. "Right in the reception area where everyone can see it." Henry beamed with pride as they headed to lunch at his favorite sandwich shop, chattering excitedly about the other presentations and his upcoming soccer tournament.
Clara listened attentively, savoring this ordinary moment with her family, while marveling at how extraordinary her life had become since that pivotal dinner 7 years ago, when everything had changed. Later that afternoon, after dropping Henry at soccer practice and checking in on Sophie,
who was enjoying a play date with Margot's grandchildren under the watchful eye of their longtime nanny, Clara made her way to the Foundation's headquarters. Located in a renovated Victorian house near downtown, the offices balanced professional functionality with the warm, inviting atmosphere crucial for their sensitive work. Andrea, the Foundation's executive director, who had been with the organization almost since its inception, greeted Clara in the reception area. "The Johnson family reconciliation session went beautifully this morning," she reported with quiet satisfaction. 27 years of estrangement, and they were actually laughing together by the end of the session. The daughter and father are meeting for lunch next week, first time in nearly 3 decades. Clara smiled, the news warming her heart. "That's wonderful. Any significant challenges?" "Nothing our team couldn't handle," Andrea replied. "Dr. Matthews is preparing a full report, but he said it was one of the most successful first sessions he's facilitated in years." As they walked through the building, Clara greeted staff members and checked in on the day's activities. In what had once been a formal dining room, a support group for parents estranged from adult children was in progress, facilitated by a compassionate therapist who specialized in intergenerational trauma. Upstairs, individual counseling sessions took place in comfortable offices, designed to feel more like living rooms than clinical spaces. The Foundation's work had evolved over the years, informed by research, experience, and the needs expressed by the families they served. They had added specialized programs for LGBTQ+ individuals rejected by family members, culturally specific approaches for immigrant families navigating intergenerational conflicts exacerbated by cultural differences, and targeted support for families fractured by political divisions, a growing concern in recent years. "Oh, I almost forgot," Andrea said as they reached Clara's office. "There's a woman waiting to see you. She wasn't on your schedule, but she was quite insistent. Says she read about the Foundation in a national magazine article and drove 3 hours to speak with you personally. I put her in the small conference room with some tea." Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. While the Foundation's growing profile had led to increased media coverage, it was unusual for someone to arrive unannounced and request a meeting with her specifically. "Did she give a name?" "Diane Phillips," Andrea replied, consulting her tablet. "She said you wouldn't know her, but that her situation has similarities to yours and your mother's. I got the impression it was quite urgent to her." "I'll meet with her," Clara decided, checking her watch. "I have about 45 minutes before I need to pick up Henry from soccer." The small conference room was designed for intimate conversations, comfortable seating arranged around a low table rather than the formal configuration that might intimidate people already in emotional distress. The woman sitting there, clutching a cup of tea with both hands, appeared to be in her early 60s, with silver-streaked dark hair and the tense posture of someone bracing for rejection. "Miss Phillips, I'm Clara Davidson," Clara introduced herself, extending her hand. "I understand you've come quite a distance to speak with me today." Diane Phillips rose to shake Clara's hand, her grip firm despite her obvious nervousness. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I know how busy you must be." "Not at all," Clara assured her, gesturing for them both to sit. "Andrea mentioned you read about our foundation in a magazine?" "Yes," Diane confirmed, reaching into her bag to produce a well-worn copy of a national publication featuring a profile of the Elizabeth Morgan Foundation. "This article, it was like reading about my own life, but from the other perspective." She hesitated, then continued with visible effort. "My daughter Jessica and I haven't spoken in almost 5 years. She lives less than 30 minutes from me with my 2 grandchildren I've never met. And it's my fault. I said terrible things to her when she needed my support most, and now she won't even answer my letters." Clara listened attentively as Diane outlined a painfully familiar scenario, a relationship fractured by misunderstanding, pride, and words spoken in moments of stress that could never be fully retracted. In Diane's case, she had criticized her daughter's choice of partners during a vulnerable time in Jessica's life, leading to a complete severing of their relationship just before Jessica's marriage and subsequent children. "When I read about how you called your mother a burden," Diane said, her voice thick with emotion, "and how she forgave you, how you reconciled before it was too late, I thought maybe there was hope for Jessica and me. That maybe it's not too late for us either." "It's rarely too late," Clara said gently, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the locket at her wrist. "But reconciliation requires willingness on both sides, and it requires the person who caused the harm, in your case, by your own admission, that's you, to approach the relationship with genuine remorse and a commitment to change." Diane nodded, wiping away a tear. "I've tried writing letters. I've sent gifts for the children that come back unopened. I even went to her house once, but she wouldn't come to the door. I could see her through the window, just looking at me standing there, then turning away. It broke my heart." "Those rejected attempts at connection are painful," Clara acknowledged, "but they're also important information. They tell you that your daughter isn't ready yet, that the hurt is still too raw. Pushing harder can sometimes deepen the rupture rather than begin to heal it." "Then what can I do?" Diane asked desperately. "I'm 64. I don't want to die without meeting my grandchildren, without making peace with my only child." Clara considered the question carefully, drawing on both her personal experience and the expertise she'd developed through years of work with the foundation. "The first step is to truly understand the harm from your daughter's perspective, not to defend or explain your actions, but to genuinely see how they affected her." "I've tried," Diane insisted. "I've apologized in my letters." "There's a difference between saying, 'I'm sorry if you were hurt,' and truly understanding the impact of our actions. In my case, it took my mother's illness for me to recognize how deeply I had wounded her by dismissing her value, by treating her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished. That realization changed me fundamentally, not just how I treated her, but how I viewed my relationships with everyone in my life." Diane was quiet for a moment, absorbing this distinction. "So you're saying I need to change first before reconciliation is possible?" "I'm saying that genuine reconciliation requires genuine transformation, not just modified behavior to get what you want, access to your grandchildren, but a fundamental shift in how you understand and respect your daughter's autonomy and choices." She reached for a notepad and pen on the conference table. "Our foundation offers several programs that might help you begin this process. There's a support group specifically for parents estranged from adult children, where you can learn from others in similar situations. We have individual counseling to help you process your grief and develop strategies for potential reconnection. And we offer guided letter writing workshops, where you'll learn how to communicate in ways that open doors, rather than inadvertently reinforce walls." As Clara outlined these resources, she watched hope gradually replace desperation in Diane's expression. By the time they concluded their impromptu meeting, Diane had registered for the next support group session and scheduled an initial counseling appointment. "Thank you," Diane said as they stood to leave, "not just for these resources, but for sharing your story in that article. It helped me see that I'm not alone in making terrible mistakes with the people I love most, and that there might still be a path forward, even if it's not the quick resolution I was hoping for." The work of reconciliation is rarely quick, but in my experience, it's always worth the effort. Even if full restoration isn't possible, the personal growth that comes from honestly confronting our own contributions to the estrangement is valuable in itself. After Diane departed, Clara gathered her things to pick up Henry from soccer practice, her thoughts still lingering on their conversation.
How many Dianes were out there? Parents, children, siblings living with the aching void of estrangement, uncertain how to begin rebuilding what had been broken. How many families were one miscommunication away from the same fate? The need seemed endless, but so was her commitment to meeting it, one family at a time. That evening, after dinner had been cleared and the children were occupied with their evening routines, Clara retreated to her home office to review some final paperwork for the Foundation's upcoming fundraising gala. The annual event had grown from a modest dinner in a local restaurant to a significant occasion that drew supporters, volunteers, and beneficiaries together to celebrate the organization's impact and raise funds for its continued growth. As she sorted through possible speaker arrangements, Clara's gaze fell on a framed photograph on her desk, herself and her mother, taken during one of those precious final months. Despite Elizabeth's physical frailty, her eyes radiated a profound peace and contentment. Clara had her arm around her mother's shoulders, her own expression a mixture of love and the beginning awareness of impending loss. The photograph had been taken by James during a rare good day when Elizabeth had felt strong enough to sit in the garden she had helped plant. Henry, then 4, had been picking dandelions nearby, occasionally bringing them to his grandmother, who accepted each one as though it were a priceless treasure. It was one of Clara's most cherished memories, a perfect afternoon when pain receded into the background and love occupied the foreground of their awareness. A soft knock interrupted her reminiscence. James stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of herbal tea, a nightly ritual they had maintained even through the busiest seasons of parenting and professional demands. "Thought you might need this," he said, placing one mug beside her paperwork. "How was your unexpected meeting today? Andrea mentioned it when I stopped by the foundation to drop off those design proposals." Clara accepted the tea gratefully, warming her hands around the mug. "It was illuminating. This woman drove 3 hours on the strength of a magazine article, desperate to find a way back to her daughter. It reminded me of where we started, of Mom's vision for helping families heal before it's too late." James settled into the comfortable chair across from her desk. "Do you think the foundation helped her?" "I think we gave her a starting point," Clara replied thoughtfully. "The real work will be hers to do, the internal transformation that has to precede any meaningful reconciliation." "Just like you had to do," James observed. Clara nodded, taking a sip of tea. "It's still humbling to think about. How close I came to missing those final months with Mom. How easily we might have remained estranged until it was too late. Sometimes I wonder if I would have changed without her diagnosis forcing me to confront what really mattered." "I think you would have," James said with quiet certainty. "Maybe not as quickly or dramatically, but the person you are, the person you were becoming even then, wouldn't have stayed estranged forever. You have too much of your mother in you." The compliment warmed Clara more than the tea. "That's the best thing anyone could say to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, sipping their tea and enjoying the rare quiet in a household with 2 active children. Then James asked, "Have you decided on a keynote speaker for the gala?" "Almost," Clara replied. "I'm leaning toward Dr. Martinez. Her research on the health impacts of family estrangement is compelling, and she's a dynamic speaker. But I'm also considering something different this year." "Different how?" Clara set down her mug, excitement building as she articulated an idea that had been forming since her meeting with Diane Phillips. "What if, instead of having one expert speak, we created a panel of people who have experienced reconciliation from different perspectives? A parent and adult child who repaired their relationship, siblings who reconnected after years of estrangement, maybe even a professional who works with our foundation, sharing the common themes they observe in successful reconciliations." James nodded enthusiastically.
I like it. It would showcase the real impact of the Foundation's work in a way that statistics and research can't fully capture. Exactly, Clara agreed. And it might help potential donors understand that this work isn't abstract or theoretical. It's about real families finding their way back to each other, often against significant odds. As they continued discussing possibilities for the gala, Clara felt a familiar sense of gratitude wash over her. For James's unwavering support, for Henry and Sophie growing up with a sense of family connection that transcended physical presence, for the foundation that had transformed her mother's legacy of forgiveness into a force for healing in countless lives. And most of all, for the reconciliation that had allowed her to be truly present with her mother during those final precious months, to learn from her example of grace and forgiveness, and to carry those lessons forward. Later that night, after checking on both sleeping children, Clara paused at the window in the upstairs hallway that overlooked their backyard garden. The autumn moonlight silvered the same flowers her mother had helped plant 7 years earlier, now mature and spreading, a living reminder of Elizabeth's influence that continued to grow and flourish. "I hope you can see what your forgiveness created, Mom," Clara whispered to the night sky. "Not just in me, not just in our family, but in all the lives being transformed because you chose reconciliation over resentment." The gentle breeze that stirred the garden flowers felt in that moment like a mother's loving response. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.